The era of conquest of the supersonic, not without reason, is considered the most progressive period in the history of aviation, with a whole flock of birds, some of which still boggle the imagination. In this flock, one of the most impressive was the family of Archangels, every aspect of which seemed like a miracle. And the apogee of this family, of course, is the fourth brother, the most advanced of them, a monumental work of engineering thought and a real celebrity to this day. If the national symbol of the United States was an airplane, it would be that symbol. Hello aviators, Sky here, and today I present to you the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. A small comment right away. The history of the Archangel family is so wide and interesting that separate videos about all of its members have been made on this channel. It would be nice to see them first, so that you can really appreciate that huge mountain, the top of which is the SR-71. Well, now it's time to go to the hot era of the Cold War. On a hot day in 1962, the skies over Base 51 saw an airplane, the appearance of which for some time was proof of the existence of aliens. The concept of an airplane flying at speeds greater than Mach 3 at an altitude of 26 kilometers was expensive but impressive. The A-12 was the pride of Lockheed, the great hope of the CIA, and an extremely curious machine in every way. It was curious not only to aviation geeks, but also to the military. Despite the fact that initially the US Air Force was skeptical about this idea, while watching the intensive development of the program, they started to think. Lockheed grabbed hold of this interest with an iron grip. It was not enough to create an airplane, they needed to provide production and support, and the CIA, with all its desire, would have ordered 12 A-12s, which doesn't really pull the title of a long-term series. In view of this fact, the Pentagon was the main target of the Skunk Works. The Archangel's father, Kelly Johnson, threw at the air commanders a whole string of projects based on the A-12. The AF-12 interceptor, created as an alternative to the unrealized XF-108 Rapier project, the R-12 reconnaissance aircraft, the RB-12 bomber, and the more versatile RS-12 strike reconnaissance aircraft. The military liked the interceptor, and its implementation was the Kedlock project initiated in 1960, which spawned the YF-12 Trinity. It was more difficult with the bomber and strike options, as there was a competition with the North American Valkyrie program. The showdown was fierce. Lockheed, emphasizing the bombing capabilities of their aircraft, called it B-71, and the reconnaissance strike version respectively RS-71. The North American, in response, in addition to the future B-70 bomber, offered the reconnaissance strike version RS-70. As we know, none of the projects, including the already real XB-70, reached the series. But in the course of the debate, it turned out that the Air Force wanted to have their own scout planes. The Pentagon had its own disputes with the CIA. On the one hand, reconnaissance is supposed to be the job of Langley. On the other, the operation of reconnaissance aircraft, albeit in cooperation, was always performed by the Air Force. But the Archangel had become some kind of impudent amateur case, and since the guys in suits have their own plane, then the guys in uniform should have one of their own too. Confidence was given by the launch flights of the A-12, and apparently not a bad development of the YF-12 interceptors. In late 1962, the Air Force finally signed a contract with Lockheed to supply a shipment of aircraft. They quickly came up, or rather remembered, the name, RS-71. However, now it was not reconnaissance strike, but reconnaissance strategic. And now the question arises, isn't it SR-71? Is there a typo in the text? Actually, yes. The fact is that when in 1964 the US President Lyndon Johnson officially presented the latest high-speed aircraft, he was talking about two machines, the interceptor YF-12 and the reconnaissance SR-71. There are many theories about how this came about. Perhaps, reading the text filled with indices, Johnson simply mixed up the letters in places. Or perhaps, Air Force Commander Curtis LeMay preferred the SR-71, and we understand who wrote the text for the president. It was then that the well-known index was born, and the unique shape and dark color gave rise to the name Blackbird. Naturally, the projects led by the CIA remained a secret. No one knew about the existence of the A-12 and M-21 aircraft until the 1980s. Like all members of the Archangel family, the SR-71 is adapted for cruising speeds of more than Mach 3, so its appearance is typical for the family. A delta wing with leading-edge extensions stretching to the nose, fins inclined inward, and of course huge engine nacelles right in the wing consoles. At first glance it may seem that the SR-71 is the same A-12 with a couple of small changes, but in fact the changes are quite significant. First of all, we can talk about the mass. The base A-12 weighed 53 tons. The upward trend was set by the YF-12, which weighed up to 63.5 tons, and the SR-71 in this regard became the champion, the mass of which reached 78 tons, which means it was almost 50% heavier than its progenitor. Meanwhile, while the A-12 and YF-12 are almost identical in overall dimensions, the SR-71 had become 1.8 meters longer, reaching 32.74 meters. This growth is clearly visible in the increase of the size of the nose section and wing extensions in the front, as well as the tail boom in the back. As you can see, the A-12 and SR-71, although obviously being related, are still not the same. It is rather a kind of second generation, something similar to the heredity of the Hornet and Super Hornet, or the Su-27 and Su-35. When describing the appearance, of course, one cannot ignore the reason why Blackbird is Blackbird. The SR-71 received a special coating in dark blue, almost black. A dark plane is more difficult to visually detect against the dark sky, and the chemical composition of the coating, coupled with its color, increased heat transfer, slightly helping to remove heat from the airframe. Such coatings had spread quickly. They were applied on other Archangels, and in parallel, the updated versions of the U-2 Scouts also turned black. In terms of materials and production, everything is familiar. Most of the structure was made of high-strength and heat-resistant titanium alloys, capable of withstanding enormous heating and flight, and some of the elements were made of radio-absorbing composites, which reduce visibility on radars. The concept of stealth due to height, speed, and lower RCS was still relevant. As fuel, the thermostable JP-7 was used, which was classic for all aircraft of the family, as well as triethylborane, the incendiary fuel for the afterburner. The aircraft's fuel system was modernized, but the famous feature of the A-12 tanks remained in place here. On the ground, fuel was still leaking out, and the system was pressurized only when heated in flight. But it did not catch fire under normal conditions, and the aviators had already been taught, so it was not critical. Although, while working in Japan when there were heavy rains, it turned out that when JP-7 gets mixed with water, it becomes unbelievably slippery. It seems to be a trifle, but because of this the plane once almost drifted into the hangar wall. The flight scheme, in which the aircraft took off with half-empty tanks and then underwent refueling from an air tanker developed for the A-12, successfully migrated to the SR-71, and in an even higher priority. Considering that the new aircraft was considerably heavier, the excess weight had to be compensated by a reduction of the fuel supply during takeoff. Therefore now the pilots, barely taking off, immediately went to their best friends, the KC-135Q tankers. Nevertheless, improvements in the fuel systems increased its capacity by 6 tons, and this plus, coupled with the optimization of control system, made it possible to increase the SR-71's range to 5,200 kilometers or 2,800 miles. Decent, but still not enough for a strategic scout. It had to refuel several times on long-distance missions. It was quite a hustle, but not much of a choice. These two monsters on the sides had many advantages, but economy was not one of them. About the monsters. Like the brothers, the SR-71 received the J-58 turbo ramjet engines, with a full complement of included systems, giving the aircraft unrivaled speed. As the Archangel program evolved, Lockheed and Pratt & Whitney were continually improving the power plants, increasing efficiency and reliability. this was extremely important as the engines were the cause of most of the problems. There were no revolutions here, but the results were obvious. The engines had become a bit more economical, much more reliable and accurate in different operating modes, over time. And as a bonus, added a little thrust. The early J58-1 engines produced 145 kilonewtons with afterburner, while the later ones reached 151 kilonewtons, or 34,000 pounds force. When Lockheed engineers equipped the YF-12 with a second cockpit, it was a necessary measure. One pilot simply could not do so much work in parallel. However, this decision turned out to be so successful that it quickly migrated to both the M21 carrier and the SR-71. Despite the fact that the Blackbird was similar in goal setting to the Archangel, there was a lot more equipment on it, and the military apparently decided not to push their pilots to the breaking point. Considering that the working conditions were almost like on a spaceship, they weren't very relaxed anyway. The layout is already familiar. Behind the first cockpit is the second one for the reconnaissance equipment operator. The cockpit is tight and with minimal glazing, but the operator had so many electronic eyes that it was no longer necessary to look out with his own. Of course, the second cockpit had a cost. On the A-12, the main compartment of reconnaissance equipment, Q-Bay, was located behind the cockpit. On the SR-71, it was occupied by the operator's cockpit. The problem was that now there was nowhere to put the huge high-definition camera, and a whole host of additional tools had to be developed instead. The SR-71 had an advantage over the A-12, a seriously increased interior space at the front of the airframe. Blackbird received as many as 11 main internal compartments for accommodating instruments, the main of which was now in the nose. Its bonus, in addition to size, was modularity. Depending on the tasks, a compartment with one type of equipment was removed and the compartment with another was put in its place, quickly and reliably. The solution was successful. It was later applied on the U-2 and, in fact, is still applied today. The main filling of the nose compartment of the aircraft was a large rotary camera, a side-looking radar, as well as another synthetic aperture radar of the ELINT, Electronic Intelligence System. The rest of the instruments were installed in stationary compartments. Several additional cameras, rotary, panoramic, and infrared, were responsible for the visuals. Hardware development was another battle for manufacturers. They were already accustomed to terrible, cramped working conditions, but now they were required to make compact SR-71 instruments with capabilities of the big ones from the A-12. This problem wasn't solved right away, but it was solved. Fortunately, Blackbird, unlike its brother, managed to fly a lot. It should be noted that already at the stage of creating the SR-71, the opinion arose that stealth, altitude and speed might soon not be enough for evading Soviet missiles. In order not to spoil the statistics with zero combat losses, the SR-71 was equipped with a serious complex of electronic air defense countermeasures and suppression. A cherry on this optoelectronic cake can be called the small window behind the operator's cockpit. The astro-inertial guidance systems looks into the sky through it. Initially, it was made for the SM-62 SNOC cruise missile and the GEM-87 Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile, and then it was added here. Fortunately, it worked at any time of day and corrected the course with a limit drift of a couple of 100 meters. Due to the location of this little helper right behind the cockpit, after the release of Star Wars in the late 1970s, it was called R2-D2. The Air Force plane was not as secret as the CIA plane, so there was no need to hide it in Groom Lake. It was flown at the Air Force Base in Palmdale, California. On December 22, 1964, the SR-71 made its first test flight. Tests were going pretty fast. Lockheed had already formed an experienced team of pilots, and the fleet was quickly being replenished with new machines. Among them, by 1966, their own two-seater training version, the SR-70B, appeared, similar to the relative in the A-12 series, the Titanium Goose. With its appearance, the aircraft began to be quickly mastered by Air Force pilots, who were recruited mainly from the crews of the B-47 and B-58 bombers, as well as from the U-2. The first aircraft which was put into service was delivered in 1966 to the specially formed 4200's, later 9th, Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base in California. But such a complex machine did not want to submit to its owners without incident. We can start with a fun fact. The SR-71 made its first international flight in 1967, and it was not scheduled. Navigation failure occurred during a training flight. When a few minutes later the system started working again, the plane suddenly found itself in Mexico. Alas, the problems weren't always fun. In January 1966, one of the aircraft experienced engine failure and loss of control in cruise flight. The pilots ejected, but the cruise flight on the SR-71 means Mach 3 and 26 kilometers. One of the crew members did not survive this roller coaster. The next, 1967, was the darkest year for the Blackbirds. In January, during the braking tests, the first prototype was lost. They expected beautiful action with a successful test, but got evaporated wheels, rolling off the runway, and a fire. In April, another plane crashed, once again due to the power plant. And in October, the third bird fell out of the flock, this time due to the pilots losing orientation during the night flight. In total, various incidents led to the loss of as many as 12 aircraft, but issues were fixed. 11 planes were lost before 1972, and after, only one. During the first years of active flights, the whole of America learned about the SR-71, and not only from the press, but also directly. As practice has shown, even 85,000 feet of altitude was not enough for the sonic boom from the Mach 3 aircraft to not roll over the flight areas. People were not inspired by it for long, and soon complaints and lawsuits flew at the Air Force. Curiously, among such victims was Kelly Johnson, in whose range from time to time windows would shatter, but he, for obvious reasons, was philosophical about it. Despite the progress of the program and impressive capabilities of the planes, the fate that befell the rest of the family also prevailed over the SR-71. The concept of speed and altitude did not justify itself. Air defense locators were getting more effective. Air defense missiles were getting more effective. And as a reminder, in the glorious 1964, when the SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft rose to the sky, the E-155 interceptor, better known as the MiG-25, took off in the USSR, and no one wanted to play cat and mouse with it. But the main problem of the SR-71, like its relatives, was the excessive cost and complexity of operation. Each plane was cared for like one's own child, and the process was accompanied by extremely specific requirements and a permanent shortage of spare parts. The aircraft was finally brought to daily flight frequency only by 1972, and all this with extremely high requirements for the experience and competences of ground personnel. Already in the mid-1960s, they cancelled the development of the A-12, which was still flying only because of the need for reconnaissance in Vietnam. The M21, together with the D-21 drone, did not make it to the stage of successful operation at all. The YF-12 also remained at the prototype level. In addition, despite all the shortcomings, satellites showed obvious prospects. Many officials, both in Congress and in the Pentagon, did not see the point of strategic aerial reconnaissance, especially by aircraft the production and maintenance of which were outrageously expensive. One Blackbird cost $34 million in the late 1960s. At current prices, this is more than $250 million. As a result, already in 1968, it was decided that the program would not be developed further, and after the delivery of the ordered batch of 31 aircraft, the Lockheed production line was dismantled. An observant viewer may correct me. There were 32 of them. This is another twist of the history of Archangels. In 1968, the SR-71B trainer aircraft crashed. An extremely unpleasant event, since there was only one trainer version left in the fleet, which would not be able to handle all the work, and making a new one was no longer possible. The aviators decided to show some magic. They had a YF-12 standing in a hangar, which was seriously damaged in the front part of the fuselage. The plane could go for scrap, but the engineers took its surviving part and connected it to the bow section of the similar SR-71B. Functional, but initially created for ground testing. And so, the 32nd aircraft of the family and the one-of-a-kind SR-71C was created, which was quite the Frankenstein's monster, had deviations from the norm and received the nickname Bastard, but could still fly. Reconnaissance operations began in 1968, when several aircraft arrived in Okinawa, from where they, along with the A-12, flew to Vietnam. Quite successfully. For the air defense forces of North Vietnam, the Blackbird was like Moby Dick to Captain Ahab. The hunt was relentless. Hundreds of missiles were fired at it, but the speed, altitude and stealth did their job. All the attacks resembled an attempt to shoot down a jet fighter with a multiple launch rocket system. By the way, it was then that the plane received another nickname, Habu, in honor of the Vipers inhabiting Okinawa. With the advent of the leading-edge extensions on airplanes, a fashion for all sorts of snake names appeared in the United States. The planes made many flights from Japan, and the observation zone extended to the whole of East Asia, from Vietnam to the northeast borders of the USSR. Reconnaissance missions in Europe were carried out from the Mildenhall Air Base in England. From there, planes flew over Eastern Europe and near the western borders of the Soviet Union. I'll note right away that these flights were carried out along the borders of the USSR, maybe with short-term crossings, but no one was getting deep into the airspace as the U-2 ones did. Naturally, the Allies, in the skies of which the Blackbirds flew, did not miss the chance to observe and chase the unusual bird. Sometimes they were doing quite well, of course taking into account that in a friendly sky, the Americans were not really hiding. There was even a case in 1987 when during a mission the SR-71 had a failure of one of the engines and, accompanied by Viggens, flew to one of the Swedish air bases. After declassifying this incident, some data even said that a pair of MiG-25s went to intercept Blackbird, which had lost speed and altitude, and the Scandinavians in fact saved it from being shut down. Maybe yes. In any case, the Swedish pilots received medals, so that story had a happy ending. Of course, the flights were carried out in many other regions of the world, where the US Air Force wanted to see and know something. The Middle East, for example, was quite a popular region for reconnaissance, especially during the Arab-Israeli wars. The SR-71 found itself some peaceful use as well. NASA already had experience with the YF-12, and when in 1971 one of the planes crashed, they rented a third plane from the Air Force, the YF-12C, which was in fact the SR-71 with a dummy index. Cold War bureaucracy, deal with it. There was a lot of work for them. The planes were packed with equipment and carried out tests, the number of which was limited only by the imagination of scientists and the budget. The SR-71 was terribly expensive over Vietnam. Over California, it did not become cheaper. Over time, the focus of research shifted. While at the beginning the objects of study were the aircraft themselves, later they acted as platforms for testing other technologies, mainly for space purposes. Of course, the tests were carried out not only by NASA, but also by the Air Force, which were looking for ways to expand the capabilities of their aircraft. They tested and optimized hardware and played with layouts. In the early 1970s, various ways were considered to increase internal volumes for the installation of additional systems. The tail was chosen as the best place. This is how the SR-71 with a hefty protruding tail boom appeared. Something similar can be seen on the Russian Su-34. The plane with the logical nickname Big Tail flew until 1976 with many different instruments in its fairing, but the idea was not developed further. Another, more interesting aspect of the story was of course the race for records. Flying the SR-71 at its limit modes raised the bar to a new level. The Blackbird bears the title of the fastest aircraft flying on the New York-London route, a kind of aviation Nürburgring. Remember all those pompous comparisons of the Concorde and Boeing 747? Jumbo's record on a flight from New York to London is 4 hours and 56 minutes, and Concorde next to it looks insanely fast, flying in 2 hours 52 minutes. Oh, those airliners. On the same route in 1974, the SR-71 flew to the Farnborough Air Show. It reached London in 1 hour 55 minutes, and this is taking into account the fact that on its way, it had to reduce speed and altitude to refuel. With refueling, the range could be stretched very long. In 1971, one of the aircraft made a flight with several refuelings, having spent 10.5 hours in the air and covered a distance of 13,000 miles, 24,000 kilometers. It's like flying from New York to Mumbai and then remembering that you left an iron-on and going back. And it was necessary to stop the flight because the plane ran out of nitrogen, which was used to purge the tanks from explosive vapors upon refueling. The limits of altitude and speed continued to expand. In 1976, the aircraft climbed to a maximum level flight altitude of 25,929 meters. In another flight, the same plane was accelerated to Mach 3.3, 1,905 knots, 3,529 kilometers per hour. At the same time, we can note again the small number, absence of production, and the huge cost of the aircraft. Due to the risk of loss, the aviators were afraid to take the SR-71 to the limit. An interesting illustration of this was the year 1990, when the plane, which had already been removed from service before being sent to the museum for retirement, was taken to fly it a little more boldly. 4 flights were registered, with flight speeds from 3,419 to 3,524 km per hour, and later a report was submitted on a flight at a speed of 1,948 knots, or 3,609 km per hour. However, the record was not officially registered. There is one more unofficial figure. In his memoirs, one of the SR-71 pilots indicated that during one of the reconnaissance flights over Libya, avoiding the air defense missiles, he for a short time accelerated the plane to a speed of Mach 3.5, which is already about 2,020 knots, or 3,740 km per hour. We can be skeptical about memoirs, but the information is there. But the main race for the SR-71 continued not in the world of records or even in the skies of allied and hostile countries, but in the offices of the military and politicians. The Cold War was coming to an end, military budgets were being cut, and many people were wondering, what is the point of the mega-expensive SR-71 if their work can be done much cheaper by satellites along with the U-2 aircraft? In addition, the Dragon Lady was seriously modified and became quite modern, while the Blackbird was getting outdated and its modernization turned out to be too expensive. Eventually, in 1988, the decision was made to close the program. The irony of this situation is that the war in Iraq soon began, and it turned out that in one of the largest military operations, one of the main reconnaissance tools was not available, just in time. This caused a new wave of controversy. The disputes were very heated. Both supporters and opponents were throwing all possible arguments, including that the SR-71 should fly because it is a symbol of America, or endless theories about the supposedly already flying semi-mythical Aurora superplane which was supposed to replace it. The discussion ended with a compromise decision in 1994 on the renewal of the program and the return of several aircraft to service. This was done over the next couple of years, although reconnaissance missions were not really carried out anymore, and in fact, only the NASA aircraft continued to fly. This did not last long. By the end of the 1990s, continued operation by the Air Force was deemed too expensive and not justifiable. Now satellites were responsible for strategic reconnaissance, and the more operative work in the necessary areas was taken over by the modernized Lockheed U-2, which in theory was supposed to be replaced by the SR-71. Such is the irony. By 1998, the SR-71 had retired. Research aircraft operation at NASA was completed in 1999. All the surviving planes scattered across museums, where they happily flaunt on their spots, delighting both ordinary guests and seasoned specialists. The SR-71 Blackbird takes its place on the podium of great works of aeronautical engineering and symbols of the Cold War. The era of the Archangels is over, leaving us with memories of achievements and goals to strive for. One way or another, so far, aviation thought has not created anything of the kind. Although,